Good evening to everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. It is the finale for the season as we are approaching Tisha B'Av, and we'll have a summer recess for a few weeks after that. So we always read Parshas Devarim before Tisha B'Av. As I'm sure you know, it's also known as Shabbos Chazon because of the Haftarah, and I hope that tonight we'll have occasion to draw on the Haftarah as well in our studies. So I want to start with comments of Ksav Sofer on the pasuk that we read towards the beginning of the parsha. If you're with me in the Stone Chumash, you can find it on page 942. So it's near the beginning of the parsha. Of course, as you know, Devarim, most of the book of Devarim is Moshe's soliloquy, his valediction. He is addressing the Jewish people at the end of his life, and he has quite a lot to say. And in fact, the Parsha, and indeed the book of Devarim, begins with the words, these are the words that Moshe spoke. So it's almost as if Moshe is choosing his own words, and he is sharing with the Jewish people a review of many of the events of the previous 40 years. And of course, he's restating those events and occasionally adding some, you could say, editorialization of his own. And that is my introduction to the pasuk that I'd like to look at closely together. And that is on page 942 in the Stone Chumash. It's chapter 1, verse 12. Pasuk Yud Beis. Eicha esa levadi. How can I bear on my own torchachem u'masachem v'rivchem, your contentiousness, your burdens, and your quarrels? You may know that according to the widespread minhag, the Baal Kriya reads that pasuk in the doleful melody of the book of Eicha, because it begins with the word Eicha, and there's a famous medrash which draws an association between what Moshe said here in our parsha, Eicha salavadi, how can I carry or bear on my own, and what Yirmiyah, the prophet Yirmiyah, said centuries later in the book of Eicha, Eicha Yashva Vadad, how does she dwell alone? And the Medrash also said that there's another example of the word Eicha in the oracle of Yeshaya. The prophet Yeshaya said, Eicha Haisa Lezona. How did the city that was regarded, that was renowned for its righteousness, how did it become as a harlot? Eicha Haisa Lezona. This is a well-known Medrash, and Ksav Sofer develops this theme in order to explain indeed what is the connection between them. Now, the second to the sources that are in the vision of Yeshaya and then later Yirmiyah, that sort of description of Jerusalem or the Jewish people is consistent with the context and consistent with the main message of those two prophets, especially Yirmiyah, which is one of describing the degradation of the Jewish people, the downfall of the Jewish people, of course, especially the book of Eicha, which is devoted entirely to that subject. But here, it's not immediately evident or clear why Moshe uses that word, or let's say why the Medrash draws attention to it and associates Moshe's comments as somehow serving as a precursor to the lament of Yeshaya and the dirge of Yirmiyah. Eichai salavadi. Moshe is simply reflecting on the difficulty of bearing on his own the contentiousness of the Jewish people. And that is a theme which, although we don't have it in the same words, but Moshe reflects on that a few times in the course of his stewardship of the Jewish people. Moshe, on more than one occasion, reflects on the challenge that he faces in leading such a contentious and sometimes cantankerous people. But from the immediate context here, we still are faced with the need for an explanation. The reason is that Moshe essentially is describing here the increase of the Jewish people, how in their early stages, let's say, when the Jewish people first descended to Mitzrayim. Of course, that was long before the days of Moshe, but as we know, their numbers were small, only 70 members of an extended family. But when they emerged from slavery 210 years later, they had vast numbers. So Moshe says, so to speak, such a large and let's say vigorous people who have naturally disputes and contentiousness. So how can I judge them on my own? To get to the point, when we look at the next pasuk, the Torah says, "Havulechem anashim chachamim nevonim v'yiduim l'shivtechem." Appoint for yourselves, provide distinguished men, wise, understanding, well known to your tribes, and I will appoint them as heads. And it says, "V'tanu osi v'tomru tovadavar." Good idea. This suggestion, this proposal that Moshe says, I can't deal with the demands of this people single-handedly. I need a judiciary to support me. This, of course, we recognize as the suggestion of Moshe's wise and insightful father-in-law, Yitro. And the Torah in the portion of Yitro describes how Yitro came to join the Jewish people, whether before Matan Torah or after Matan Torah. And he saw that Moshe's time was completely monopolized by judging the people. And he suggested, Navol Tibol, you can't cope on your own. And Moshe here, reflecting back on those events, couches it in more personal terms rather than just an observation from an outside consultant. He says it as if it was his own feeling as well. How can I bear this burden on my own? And you said to me, great idea. Why does Moshe therefore bemoan it here? Why is it that when the suggestion is first advanced, it was endorsed by Hashem, it was implemented, and as far as we know, it worked well? Here, Moshe, for the first time, bemoans those events. He says that I was faced with an impossible situation, like a rhetorical question, how can I bear your contentiousness, etc., on my own? The solution was a judiciary, and all of this is couched in the freighted term Eicha, which brings to mind the Eicha of Yishai, which leads to the Eicha Yashva Badad of Yirmiyah. That's the question. I've elaborated upon it a little bit. Says the Ksav Sofer that the answer perhaps lies in what we read in the book of Yeshaya, and I can encourage you at this point to turn to the Haftarah. If you're with me in the Stone Chumash, you can find it easily on page 1196. If you have a different Chumash, you can certainly find it as the Haftarah for Parshas Devarim. It's the Haftarah of Chazon, begins with the words Chazon Yeshayahu ben Amoz, and there we find in Pasuk Chaf Aleph the famous pasuk to which we already referred, Eicha Haisalu Zona Kirya Ne'emana. How has she become a harlot, the faithful city that was full of justice, in which righteousness was wont to lodge, but now murderers? What a decline. But take a look at Pasuk Chaf Gimel. Sarayich Sorarim v'chavrei ganavim kulo ohev shochad v'orech shalmonim. Look at the English. Your princes are wayward and associates of thieves. The whole of them loves bribery and pursue illegal payments. Says the Ksav Sofer, this is the point. The lament of Yeshaya, of how the city that was known for its righteousness has now become corrupted, and the judges, the princes, the leaders are susceptible to bribery. And in fact, maybe that's even why they went into the legal profession, because they could be enriched by bribery in this way. That is the downfall of the people. Says Ksav Sofer, that is what Moshe foresaw. Moshe, when the idea of the judiciary was introduced, yes, it was a suggestion of Yitro. And we asked at the time, I say at the time because I don't know if it was in this year, but in the previous years, we have analyzed that interesting, important passage of the advice of Yisro. We asked the question, which is obvious, if it was such a good idea, why didn't Moshe think of it himself? Or why didn't Hashem legislate it ab initio? Why was the advice only introduced by Yisro? The answer would seem to lie in what Moshe says over here, namely that the Ta'anu, and you responded to me in Pasuk Yud Dalet, Vatomru, you said that's a great idea. If you take a look at Rashi, V'ta'anu osi, so Rashi here says, Chalatetem esadavar lahanaschem, you decided on this proposal for your own benefit. Hayalachem lashib, you should have responded to my suggestion or Yisro's suggestion. Let's have a judiciary. lower courts, higher courts, court of appeal, you should have responded, Rabbeinu Moshe, Mimina Elil Mod, Moshe, our teacher, from who is it better to learn? Mimcha mitalmidcha, from you or from your disciple? Lo mimcha, isn't it best to learn from you? Shenitsta'arta aleha. You have exerted yourself. You have devoted yourself to the Jewish people so to such an extent. We'd rather learn from you. In other words, we would rather be judged only by you. The Jewish people should have rejected the proposal of Israel. Why didn't they reject it? Because of their own self-interest. Because they thought, you know what, Moshe, we know is incorruptible. But judges, Yiduim L'Shivtechem, that we know, they're cousins, because each tribe, of course, are closely related, relatively closely related to one another. And they lived in their tribal enclaves, and therefore the judges of each tribe were known to the tribe. It means they're my cousins, or second cousins, or my neighbors, or my friend, or I have some connection to that person. And if I don't, I can always bribe him, because money talks. And that is why the people were pleased with the suggestion of Yisro. It wasn't so much because of concern for Moshe's stamina, and it wasn't so much even for concern for their own boredom of having to wait in line for so long. And it wasn't because they thought that this is going to be a more efficient system. They thought this is a more corruptible system. Moshe himself was incorruptible, but these lower courts, lower judges, they can be corrupted. And that idea found its poisonous, toxic fruition generations, centuries later, in the condemnation of Yeshaya, the prophet of Isaiah, who observed that these judges, they are all susceptible to bribery. Perhaps not all of them, but many of them were. And by the time, as I said, as Yeshaya says, the generations descended through corruption, through influence of idolatry, no doubt through other factors as well, the corruption had become endemic. Says Ksav Sofer, the roots, the origins, the seed, the germ of that disastrous outcome was planted here, and that's why Moshe says, Eicha Salavadi, using that word, Eicha, which evokes, which brings to mind the Eicha of Yeshaya and the Eicha of Yirmiyah as well. This is how Ksav Sofer explains it, and he says that, of course, when the Jewish people had only one leader, one ultimate authority, and that was Moshe, then he was towering above any possibility of self-interest or corruption. But because the judiciary system was implemented, and perhaps those people themselves were worthy, or maybe not, as we'll soon see, but the precedent found its expression generations later and led ultimately to the corruption and the breakdown of the integrity of the judicial system. Ksav Sofer ends his comments by saying that it's known, as the Medrash says, im ein din lemata yesh din lemala. If there's no justice below in the human courts, yesh din lamala, then Hashem will be the one to judge. In other words, if the courts do not punish those who are deserving of punishment, or do not convict those who are deserving of conviction, or do not condemn someone who has exploited or stolen, and ensure that justice is served and that the victim is recompensed, if the judges fail in that regard, there will be judgment from above. That is to say, a harsh judgment potentially. And this is how ultimately the outcome of the events that we mourn on Tisha B'Av came about. Just to add very briefly, because Ksav Sofer doesn't say this, but the question that's left dangling is practically the observation of Yisro still is upheld, namely that when you have a population of 600,000 men and a similar number of women, and those who are younger as well, a population of probably 2 to 3 million, is it not inevitable that there will be court hearings and cases and grievances and neighborly disputes and other kinds of disputes? It's inevitable in such a population of such numbers that one judge can never conceivably cope. Isn't that ultimately a sensible observation? The answer we suggested is that is true for a judicial system. But what the Jewish people need ideally is not a judicial system, they need an educational system. And as an educational system, Moshe Rabbeinu is the only educator that the Jewish people need. Of course, Moshe would teach others and they will teach others, and the Medrash describes how that would happen. But ultimately, if the Jewish people are educated and inspired and motivated only by the desire to do the right thing, the need for a judicial system will be greatly alleviated. Most instances of a court hearing in which two disputants or more are disagreeing or condemning one another, blaming one another, most of the time it's because of self-interest. Of course, self-interest is human nature, but the Torah seeks to elevate us to the best of human nature, not the worst of human nature, to aspire only to what is right. And if two people both aspire only to the truth, then the possibility of their needing to settle their differences in a court of law will be greatly diminished. Okay, I don't want to say more about that because that really is for a separate shir in Parasha, so now's not quite the time for it. But this is what Ksav Sofer says, the connection between the Eicha here and later on, essentially it's the judiciary which represents the precursor to the subsequent decline and the corruption which Yeshaya denounces and laments hundreds of years later. Now, the next comment that I want to share with you is related to this. So that's the pasuk we already looked at briefly. Let's take another look at it right now. Pasuk Yud Gimel, verse 13. Havu lachem anashim chachamim unevonim v'yiduim l'shivteichem v'asimei beroshechem, which our scroll renders, provide for yourselves distinguished men who are wise, understanding, and well known to your tribes, and I shall appoint them as your heads. Now, it's interesting that when we look 2 verses later, the next pasuk Tesvav, verse 15 says, "Va'ikach es roshei shivteichem anashim chachamim v'yiduim," etc. I took the heads of your tribes. So in pasuk Yud Gimel, verse 13, it says, "Havu lachem," you provide. And 2 verses later, Moshe says, I took them, I chose them, I selected them. So Rashi was alert to that. And Rashi says as follows, really Moshe put the challenge or the responsibility or the opportunity or the privilege or the license to the tribes, to the Jewish people collectively, and said, appoint for yourselves, designate them, nominate them, and those will be the judges. That was the original idea. But 2 verses later, when the pasuk says, "Va'ikach es roshei shivteichem," I took them. So Rashi says, by way of resolving the inconsistency, Rashi says, "Mashachtim." Take a look at Rashi. "Va'ikach es roshei shivteichem, mashachtim bedvarim." I drew them with words. I persuaded them, or I encouraged them. Ashreichem, I said, fortunate are you. Ami basim lihimanos al bnei Avram Yitzchak Yaakov. You are the officers who will exercise authority over great people, descendants of Avram Yitzchak Yaakov. It's interesting, if you think about it, really, about that comment of Rashi, when Moshe himself was approached by Hashem to take on the role of leading the Jewish people, Moshe didn't want anything to do with it. He demurred repeatedly. And here, when the shoe is on the other foot, where Moshe is trying to persuade other people to take on a leadership role, so now he's saying, well, that's great, Ashreichem, how fortunate are you? Well, Moshe didn't think it was such great fortune for him, but okay, I don't want to be cynical. It's just interesting how now that Moshe has been the leader, so he's looking to persuade others to participate in the same role, albeit at an intermediate level, not at the top level of Moshe. That is Rashi's comment, and again, Rashi is responding to the fact that here it says Va'ikach. In 2 verses previous, it said Havu lachem, you produce. Says Ksav Sofer, I've got a different idea though. Moshe's suggestion was, you produce people, anashim chachamim unevonim, righteous and learned, insightful, well-known. But then he saw who they produced, and they chose people, as Rashi told us previously. They chose people who they could corrupt. They advanced people who were in it for self-interest. That is to say, people who were not necessarily devoted purely out of a desire for public service, but maybe out of a desire for personal enrichment. And it suited the people to have such leaders because then they can be subject to bribery, to corruption, to influence, and similar. When Moshe saw that those were the kinds of people that the tribes of Israel advanced, Moshe said, you know what? I'm going to choose my own people. I decided I'm going to choose. Actually, I don't want to rely on your proposed personnel, but rather I'm going to make the judicial appointments. And that's how Ksav Sofer explains that he Moshe ultimately was disappointed with the people that the nation advanced. Again, doesn't mean with all of them necessarily, but at least in some cases, Moshe felt more confident in his doing this selection. He says, Shuv lo ratza Moshe sheyeh lehem mishpat habechira. Decide, I don't want to give them the people the opportunity to choose. They're choosing people who are fond of bribes. Moshe therefore revised his approach, and he changed his mind effectively. And he chose the people whom he thought were actually well suited to the role. But even so, even when Moshe chose people who he believed were well suited, but not one of them was as great as Moshe Rabbeinu himself, and therefore the whole proposal from the very start was, I won't say doomed, but from the very start, in Moshe's view, was ill-considered. But it was only because the people demanded it. The people responded enthusiastically to the suggestion. So they said, so Moshe had no choice but to follow through with the proposal, even though it would have been better. I'll say just that he would have preferred, but it would have been better if the people had said, no, we don't want a judiciary. We want to learn only from you. I want to share with you one last thought, and I have chosen this partly because I don't want to end our studies for the season on a kind of doleful note, although it is Shabbos Chazon, so perhaps it's to a certain degree in keeping with the rhythm of the season, but I wanted to end on something happier anyway, and this is a thought that comes from the Haftarah. We've already looked at a couple of psukim in the Haftarah, and here's one more for us as well. So if you turn back to the Haftarah, wherever you may find it in your Chumash. If it's in the stone Chumash, it's page 1196, or whatever Chumash you're using. You can open up a Tanakh for that matter as well. So take a look at chapter 1, verse 19. So here, the prophet is much more hopeful in this pasuk, even though the main trend of this Haftarah, of course, is one of rebuke. That's why it is the Shabbos that precedes Tisha B'Av. Excuse me, but in that pasuk in Yutes, verse 19, he says, "Im tovu ushamatem tuv haaretz tochelu." Im tovu ushamatem. Now, the word tovu doesn't mean, not related to the word tov. That's the second half of the pasuk. Tuv haaretz tochelu. You will eat of the best of the land, or the goodness of the land. That's the second half of the pasuk. The first words, im tovu shematem, tovu, comes from the word ta'ava, desire. Even though ta'ava is spelt with a vav, but the word ta'ava is also spelt with a vav sometimes as well. Avu, aleph, base vav. Avu is to desire. In tovu shematim. The art school people render it, if you will be willing and you will obey. But according to Ksav Sofer, the word tovu doesn't just mean if you will be willing, but if you desire. If you desire and obey. In the poetic language of the prophet, these are related thoughts. Tovu, if you desire, ushematem, and you hearken, meaning if you do what's right, if you listen to the words of the Torah, or if you hearken to the admonitions of the prophet, as the art scroll people say, if you will be willing and you will obey. Those are basically two ways of saying a similar idea. You could also ask, why do you need im tovu? Just say ushamatim, im shamatim. If you listen, if you obey, things will go well with you. What's the need for the word tovu if you are willing? Says Ksav Sofer, the word tovu here, as I just said now, is related to the word ta'ava. Ta'ava is desire. It means if you not only do the mitzvot, if you listen and you fulfill the mitzvot, but if you desire them as well, if you have a motivation, a bren, as we say in Yiddish, which is fire, if you're enthusiastic, if you're excited about the mitzvahs, and if you enjoy the simcha of the mitzvah. That's what Ksav Sofer says. The prophet is saying here, tovu shematim, if you do it with enthusiasm, with tava, with a desire. And he says the following interesting idea. Ksav Sofer says, he attributes it to a medrash. The editor of this edition that I have says, actually, we don't quite find it in a medrash, but he says that elsewhere, Ksav Sofer attributes the same idea to the hafla'ah. Hafla was Rav Pinchas Halevi Ish Horovitz. He was the Rav in Frankfurt, and he wrote a parish called Hafla'ah, also that's on the Shas. He also wrote Panim Yafos on the Torah, and the editor says that later on, elsewhere, the Ksav Sofer attributes to Hafla'ah, but actually, he said, I can't find it in the writings of the Hafla'ah either. But I would just add that Ksav Sofer, of course, was a leading disciple of his father, Chassam Sofer. Chassam Sofer was a leading disciple of Hafla'ah. And Chassam Sofer quotes Hafla'ah quite a lot. And it's very possible that Ksav Sofer, our friend for the year, heard it from his father in the name of his Rebbe, Rav Pinchas Halevi Horovitz of Frankfurt. So it could be that it does not appear in his writings, but he heard it from his father named Hafla. In any case, it's also found in the Bnei Yissaschar, quoted in the name of the Chidah, and it's also found in the Pardes Yosef in the name of the Ritva. I'm only mentioning this because it's a beautiful idea found in various sources, and who said it first, I'm not quite certain, but anyway, let me share it with you. He says that schar mitzvah b'hai alma leka. That is a very important principle, that the reward for mitzvot in this world, we don't have it. That is to say, the currency for the reward for a mitzvah is too precious to be transmitted or transformed into earthly reward. Reward for mitzvahs is in the next world. Like we say, these are the things ochel perusein balam, as a person eats the fruit in this world, but the keren kayim is low, but the principle is preserved for the next world. That's the general idea, that schar mitzvah ha'alma leka. But says the Ksav Sofer, in the name of the Medrash or Hafla or other sources as well, that the fulfillment of a mitzvah person is not rewarded in this world. But the simcha shel mitzvah, a person can be rewarded in this world as well. Two people who do a mitzvah in the same way, or that is to say, they do the mitzvah in a technically correct manner, but one person does it with enthusiasm and delight and pleasure and excitement, and another person does it without those qualities. Of course, the first one's fulfillment of that mitzvah is at a higher level, even if technically they're both done in the same way. But the association with the mitzvah, the associated enthusiasm and excitement and joy and pleasure. Says Iksav Sofer, that's what the prophet means here. Im tovu ushema'atem, if you desire the mitzvah, if you have a yearning, a craving for the mitzvah, and you do the mitzvah, then tuv haaretz tochel, you will eat of the goodness of the land. It's interesting, the Ksav Sofer says elsewhere a similar idea, and that is that maybe the mitzvah, you don't get rewarded in this world, but the effort that a person expends in the mitzvah, or the expense that a person expends in the mitzvah, for that he will be rewarded. It's a similar idea here in which he says the joy, the simcha, the enthusiasm, the excitement, for that a person is rewarded even in this world. And that is a positive note on which I'd like to end our shir tonight and our summer series. Emetz Hashem, we'll pick it up again in September, and I wish everybody a wonderful Shabbos. So happens that the pasuk we spoke about today, we're going to speak about from a different angle entirely on Shabbos, and that is Chabad ideas on the Parasha. And if you're wondering what I mean by that, come to the Shir on Shabbos, you'll find out. Okay, thank you to everyone, and wish everyone a good Shabbos.